put yourself in the future, understand the environment, the implications of that environment, and then develop a vision, more than just a vision statement, but an actual view of the future enterprise, and then to walk it back in steps that become milestones about where things need to be. Say you go 10 years out, where do they need to be 8 years in order to achieve the 10-year out future state objective? Then where does it need to be 6 years, 4 years, and just walk back to today into the kinds of initiatives, innovation, growth initiatives that need to be started as seeds to plant.
Hi, I'm James Taylor, business creativity and innovation keynote speaker, and this is The Creative Life, a show dedicated to you, the creative. If you're looking for motivation, inspiration, and advice while at home, at work, or on your daily commute, then this show is for you. Each episode brings you a successful creative, whether that's an author, musician, entrepreneur, performer, designer, or thought leader. They'll share with you their journey, their successes, their failures, their creative process, and much, much more. You'll find show notes for this episode, as well as free training on creativity, over at jamestaylor.me. Enjoy this episode. Hey there, it's James Taylor, and I'm delighted today to have on the show Mark Johnson. Mark Johnson is co-founder and senior partner of Innosight, a strategic innovation consulting and investing company with offices in Massachusetts, Singapore, and Switzerland, which he co-founded with Harvard Business School professor Clayton M. Christensen. He has been a strategic advisor to both Global 1000 and startup companies in a wide range of industries, including automotive, healthcare, aerospace, defense, enterprise IT, energy, and consumer packaged goods. He is the author of Lead from the Future, How to Turn Visionary Thinking into Breakthrough Growth, a manifesto for future back thinking, and a hands-on guide to long-term planning, strategy development, and execution within established organizations. And it's my great pleasure to have Mark with us today. So welcome, Mark.
Thank you, James. It's great to be here.
So share with us all what's happening in your world at the moment.
Well, I think just like the entire world, we're dealing with the COVID-19 crisis, and it has been an interesting time because with the reality of this crisis is points of inflection have just moved way up. Points of inflection caused by this disruption, and we talk about it in terms of that and trend lines becoming much steeper. So we're spending a lot of time. We're trying to help think through as our own firm Innosight, but also in our clients and just generally advising companies and institutions, how to not think about the long-term horizon, but to think about, 12 to 18 months along with the immediate situation, and plan for a host of things which are going to be a new normal. And it's pretty all-consuming, needless to say, and certainly our hearts go out to all those that are, especially medical professionals and families and individuals who are suffering with the virus itself. So that's the all-consuming thing that's happening in my life these days.
And it seems interesting as we're going through this. You're seeing lots of quite interesting innovation coming out, especially obviously in medical devices side. I saw one yesterday. There was an initiative between, I think it was a University College London in the UK and Mercedes Formula One team, who have put together a type of thing for helping people breathe, which would normally take a long time to create these units. And I believe this one, I think it costs about $1,000, and they can produce about 1,000 a day, some ridiculous number, and it's very simple to create. So when you're kind of talking with your clients, are clients just now, are they still in kind of deer in the headlights mode, or are some of them now getting kind of set to think, okay, what are some of the possibilities? Can we use this, as you were talking about, these as an inflection point to push it a bit further, to take some of those bigger, kind of more disruptive types of innovation?
Well, it's interesting. I mean, of course, it varies on the client and non-clients, other people, other institutions. It runs across the board. Certainly, there's quite a bit of fear and concern, and there's uncertainty, and what to do now, what to do next. But there is also, to your point, necessity is the mother of invention, and these points of inflection create opportunity for things that have been stuck or slow to get unstuck. And, things like, just again, in the healthcare world, telemedicine, telehealth, these things, now are probably going to be on steroids. And like, as you mentioned in that example with Mercedes, in the F1 team and helping to, drive innovation very rapidly, I think there is a recognition that, well, again, the crisis at hand is nothing that anybody wished for. And, there's still a lot of ways to go before we're going to be even close to getting out of it. It's also an opportunity to plan, and to plan with a lot of innovation in mind and creativity in mind, to be able to uh, make changes in the way things will be and should be, with the recognition of what's happened with this crisis and how it's really unstuck a lot of things based on the necessity and a recognition of aspects of the business that are going to be the same and things that are going to be different. So we see as much, how should I put it, instinct to begin planning for some new normals as it is to deal with the immediate crisis.
Now, as well as being obviously an innovation consultant, having Innosight, reading one of the chapters of the book, it also looks like you're almost like an innovation historian. There were some really nice images, pictures of how maybe people thought about. I think one of the ones I saw was about going from the horse and cart to the train, and not looking. So, as you kind of look back, are there any kind of lessons that we can actually learn from history? Maybe when there's, you think about the Renaissance came from the bubonic plague. A lot of that, a lot of things kind of came out because of a huge level of disruption. In Vienna, the kind of golden creative age came after a period of terrible, I think it was cholera epidemic as well. If you kind of look back, are there other times in kind of history where we see that these huge social changes, whether it's wars or health or something, has a very profound effect on how we think about innovation, how we innovate?
Well, I think absolutely. To your point about these major points of crises, first of all, they bring opportunity for people to come together in ways that, maybe at least in the American political system, the Democrats and Republicans have had to come together and problem solve and pass a economic stimulus package that normally there would just be such infighting and intractability that would never happen. So, one is, I think these crises bring together a level of ingenuity and a level of impairment and kind of bring forth resources and know-how that that might not normally happen in other times. I think it wasn't at the level of what's happening. It certainly wasn't a crisis like this, or it wasn't a war, a great world war or anything like that. But when the United States felt a bit threatened, in the kind of as part of the space race, that created a sense of urgency to put a man on the moon, and so it really galvanized, the United States, and putting together resources to be able, based on a vision and a goal, to get a man on the moon by the end of, the 1960s, by the end of the decade. So I do think you see resources, people come together to do things that otherwise they wouldn't do, that it creates a sense of urgency, a necessity, an ability to really explore in a way that might otherwise be encumbered by the here and now, and just trying to increment off of the way things are continuing to be moved forward today. So I think that we see those opportunities, and I think that in World War II you saw the whole Manhattan Project and the atomic bomb being sort of accelerated based on the need to try to end the war, and the threat of the Germans and all of that. So I do think that there's lessons to learn. And I think it also, to your point about the train and how it was developed off of the stagecoach, it's important to recognize that as we move forward and we recognize that not everything is a continuous line when you have these disruptions, that you actually don't extrapolate off of the way things are now, but you go into the future and anticipate how things could be systematically developed in a fundamentally different way, which hopefully we'll talk about as related to the book.
So this is one of the things that you can call a manifesto for future back. So explain, for someone that hasn't heard that phrase, future back thinking. What is that, and what are the principles around that can maybe help us go from perhaps a short-term way of planning and thinking about innovation to something much perhaps bigger, much grander?
Sure. Well, James, I mean, I think there are two parts to understand future back. One is the way of thinking, and then the other is the process or the way of planning. As it pertains to the way of thinking, future back is all about using the right brain. It's about thinking from a clean sheet, systematic, where you're not encumbered by how things are today or in the past, but you're willing to think in a whole new paradigm. And as I mentioned, you think from this sort of right brain creative side versus the left brain analytical side. You're more focused on questions as answers. You talk about the art of the possible. It's very similar to the design thinking movement. And so you want to be able to then put yourself in the future more in this assumptions driven questioning kind of way, as I said, to clean sheet something and then to form a new system as opposed to pulling off the old, as an exercise in the art of the possible, and to make sure that today's orthodoxies don't, at least at the start, influence how things should be as opposed to the way they are. That's the first part, is to develop. The other part of it is the way of planning or the process, and that is as it sounds. It's to be able to put yourself in the future, understand the environment, the implications of that environment, and then develop a vision, more than just a vision statement, but an actual view of the future enterprise, and then to walk it back in steps that become milestones about where things need to be. Say you go 10 years out, where do they need to be 8 years in order to achieve the 10-year out future state objective? Then where does it need to be 6 years, 4 years, and just walk back to today into the kinds of initiatives, innovation, growth initiatives that need to be started as seeds to plant to try to achieve the intended future destination. So that's how I would describe it.
That reminds me a little bit of there's a phrase that Charlie Munger, Warren Buffett's business partner, always uses when he thinks about strategy. He says, "Invert, always invert." About kind of going. So you're saying going to that, dreaming and kind of going to that far place, and then, as you said,
yes,
figuring out what those staging posts are kind of working back the way. As well. So that's obviously that kind of leader, that leadership team that are thinking about that. How do you take perhaps that kind of grander vision of where you see things, where you are kind of going 5-10 years out, and then converting that into some kind of strategic plan that the team can really align around and commit to? Perhaps a team that's very focused on quarterly objectives, quarterly goals, targets, etc. How do you link those two things up?
Yeah, so it's definitely, there's a method to it, and we lay this out through a set of chapters in the book. But I'll try to summarize it, that hopefully in a way that the audience can visualize this. I think you have to try to take a point of view, a qualitative view about how things will look 5 to 10 years out. We call it an impressionist painting as opposed to a photograph. But again, it's tied towards tangibles like a portfolio of high-level businesses and opportunities beyond the core, along with what the core might look like. And then be able to translate that into what we call a future state portfolio, which is literally a quantified revenue or profit objective where you've defined what the core business would contribute to that aspiration, that financial aspiration in part, or if you're a nonprofit, towards the kind of impacts that you want to have as the nonprofit, or achievements, if you will, or influence as your part of your mission. And how do you lay that out in a future state portfolio? That begins the first step of strategy. That the portfolio is not today, actually, the portfolio is imagined as part of that vision in the 5 to 10 year horizon. And then you walk it back kind of one to one to the kinds of initiatives that you would have over the next 1 to 3 years that would move you towards that future state portfolio, while also recognizing an investment portfolio over the next couple of years that funds these different growth initiatives. So the translation of vision to strategy is manifest in the way that you portfolio manage, but the portfolio management has a time dimension. There's a future state portfolio as well as present portfolios, and hopefully that's clear enough to see it. But
I've heard other companies, because of those, we hear, for example, that they're for every kind of one Elon Musk, someone that's really a very almost kind of evangelical in their view of innovation and a vision that they have for the business. That's not my perspective. That's not generally the rule. That's almost like an exception to things as well. I've heard of some companies that almost kind of start to separate out, and this is in terms of the leadership, that kind of separating out the organization into a way that this is we want to be in 10 years. We need to build a team that's going to manage the core parts of the business. And then we need to almost like build a completely separate team, almost like a separate CEO for these other kind of riskier growth areas. When you've worked with clients, have there been examples that you found particularly useful in how you kind of manage that transition between, these are the businesses that are generating all of our growth and our profitability now, whereas these are the businesses perhaps we need to invest in and be involved in order to have some kind of future?
Well, the way I would think about it, James, is, to break down your question a little bit, I think in the early days of business building, when we think about breakthrough businesses, that go beyond the core, that have a lot of ambiguity to them, it'd be like anything that you would think about in terms of early stage ventures, whether they're sort of independent startups or whether they're part of corporate venturing. I think you have to first think about it as that there's an innovation team that does need to be carved out from the core, because they're going to need to be guided by different metrics. Not the core business's pretty demanding financial metrics, but a different set that allows for learning. And in fact, we would argue in the early days that it has much less to do with financials and more about learning and learning metrics, assumptions that get proven or disproven, for example.
So that's almost like a lean startup type of methodology.
Exactly. Yeah. And so definitely you got to carve out the team, and lean startup by all means is describing exactly the way to think about the process. I think what you need to add to that, though, is that the innovation team that's carved out is directly connected to the leadership team in organizations, and large organizations and even mid-sized ones, because the leadership team is the one that is responsible for resource allocation, and they own the purse strings, and they're going to be the ones that decide whether to allocate to ventures and continue to fund them or not. And so if they're not connected in the process by which these ventures get established and developed, then there's a disconnect, both in terms of getting them started as well as allowing them to be staged over time. And what we often find is the innovation team is going through a learning process and the development of the venture, but the leadership team is very disconnected. They delegate it to a chief innovation officer or somebody that's in charge of growth, but they themselves are not aware or not participating enough in the learning journey and in an understanding of a long-term strategy by which they get the same rooted understanding about these ventures and being able to stay committed. So we like to see especially in the early days, that yes, you're carving off innovation teams and keeping them outside of the mainstream business, but the leadership team has to carve out some of their time to not just execute and operate the core business, but to be able to commit to these new ventures and sponsor and govern them in the right way.
So is there a problem in kind of finding those sponsors with the often the CEO role in many Fortune the global 1,000 companies? They don't last that long, for many of them.
Yeah.
I was talking to someone the other day. We were talking about he was involved in the NASA, space, the race to Mars, and they were bringing all their engineers and everyone together. And one of the things that kind of came out of it was, he said, we need to do things which deliver within 8 years, because that's how long a presidential term lasts. If you've got two terms, and then as soon as that president changes, it's going to be a completely new thing. They want to do their own thing again. So do you find that is an issue when it comes to getting those sponsors, maybe that kind of senior, that CEO, for example, that president of an organization, that how do you ensure that you keep that innovation team kind of working and rocking and rolling when perhaps you do have that fluctuation in the people?
This is one of the key existential questions we try to address, because it's so spot on. This strategic continuity, we call it, is just a key problem, but it's also an opportunity, which I think a couple things on this, James. One is, like the importance of stewardship as part of leadership, recognizing that as leaders, you're not going to be leaders, the whole time that the organization, the corporation is in business, but you have a responsibility for those that are going to follow in your footsteps. So having that mindset of thinking about the long view and planning for the long term, even past your tenure, which then should be the view and the supporting mechanism that gets behind these innovation efforts. So that's point one, is that I think you got to build a language and a vocabulary that then hopefully leads to a culture that's part of the way leaders work day to day. The other part of that is the role of the board of the directors, that they can be the bridge between different teams, right? To your point about having maybe no more than an 8-year tenure, that they ensure through a long-range vision and strategy that continually, by the way, gets adjusted and modified as the organization moves forward in time, that they're supporting, they're ensuring that those long-term growth initiatives are continuing to be looked at in the right way, and that elements of that strategy are preserved and continued on, and it's not just a flavor of the month kind of mentality, or I should say, the new team comes in and turns everything over and wants to do it their own way. So I think the combination of trying to build in a vocabulary and a way of thinking about the long term, and then also rethinking what boards really do, board of directors' responsibility, is a way that we can drive this strategic continuity that allows these innovation efforts to not, have so many fits and starts as the top changes over.
I think that crossover between almost like succession planning and strategic continuity, as you say as well, how those things match up in the role of the board. So let's change tacks a little bit here as well. The work you do, you're always looking at different innovations. You're working with clients all the time. You're writing. You're researching. Do you have an online resource or a tool or an app like an Evernote, for example, you find very useful in your own kind of creative process for either capturing or generating or researching these ideas?
Gosh, that's a good question. I think for me personally, there's no like specific app that I would necessarily come to mind. I do think the idea of for our own work, thinking about the deployment of a digital platform by which we can continue to, helping with our clients in our own work, try to move as much as we can to a lot of things which are in creative, unstructured problem solving towards more of a rules-based mode.
Yeah.
I think a lot of things in consulting can be moved, and within companies can be moved through the advent of digital, as if you will, an app, a tool, to be able to get much more routinized on things, so that it frees up more time where we absolutely need to be using unstructured problem solving and creativity, that we can free up more time, especially senior leaders, along with innovation teams, to be able to spend that time in a more creative way.
And I guess when you make that move to doing that kind of platform, it also gives you the opportunity to move from even just being kind of rules-based to actually bringing things like machine learning, AI as part of the process. And so you almost have AIs which are collaborative in the same way that they have things like generative design at companies like Airbus, where the human engineers and designers are collaborating with the machines on designing, prototyping, and building things. So you can almost start to bring in a machine as part of one of those, that additional member of your innovation team.
Oh, no question about it. And I do think AI, machine learning, big data, all these sort of mega trends and more specific trends do lend themselves to just the overall knowledge problem solving continuum, having a faster rate of ideas and the development of concepts, and ultimately products and services and ways of doing things, moving much more quickly to things starting kind of in mystery mode and moving much more quickly to being algorithmic or rules-based, and being recognizing that as I think more the need to continually be thinking about the new and different, because the rate of things becoming really well understood and therefore more commoditized is going to happen faster than ever with AI, machine learning.
And obviously we'll be talking about your book, but if you were to recommend a book by another author you think more of our listeners should be reading, and also an album, you're in Massachusetts, you get some great music there as well, what would the book and the album be that you would recommend to our listeners?
Well, I can't help but promote my colleague, or I should say friend and colleague, Bob Johansson from the Institute from the Future, who has his own book about thinking around the future, which is called Full Spectrum Thinking, where he's basically saying, things won't be black or white, they'll kind of fall into a spectrum, and how we deal with things in the future. I think it's a fascinating read, and I would highly recommend it, because I think, if I may dare say, another book by Rita McGrath, Seeing Around Corners, I can't emphasize enough to your audience that beginning to manage time in the sense of not time management in the classic sense, but in the sense that we not only need to manage today, based on a reflection of the past, but that we get much better at managing the future, and that's eminently manageable, is going to be a huge competitive advantage. And when you tie that to being better about learning, that's what's going to help individuals and organizations navigate the more harried pace that we all face, just given technology and the rate of knowledge expansion that's happening, given the world we live in.
And then what about the album? What would the album be? Unfortunately, Rita and Bob, I'm not sure if I don't think they're musicians as well. But maybe we need to have an innovator's dilemma, innovators band now as well. But what would the album be?
Well, you're asking a person who is stuck in the 80s, or the 70s and the 80s, and just to pitch where I'm from, I'd have to say that I would go back to classic albums like, and I wouldn't have a particular album. I would say more of a group. So groups like the Eagles and Boston, and their album Boston would be my promotion for this podcast.
Fantastic. And I want you to imagine that you wake up tomorrow morning and you have to start from scratch. So you have all the tools of your trade, all the knowledge that you've acquired over the years, but no one knows you and you know no one. What would you do? How would you restart things?
Well, I think the way I would restart things would be a little bit of our mantra, as Innosight, the consulting firm that I co-founded with Clay Christensen now 20 years ago, is I'd start things by the notion that you got to start with humility. So and needless to say, I guess if you had nothing, you would be humbled pretty well, right? But you'd ask a lot of questions, right? You would explore, you would seek to understand, or making, choices or telling someone or deciding for yourself what to do. So I would just make sure that I was really good about learning, and learning in the right way by, who I need to talk to and what kind of questions I was trying to get answered to help me know who I should speak with, that I would have a diversity of people and places where I would be trying to get understanding, and that I would use that to imagine really what is the art of the possible. Because I think in writing this book and thinking, about the importance of the long term, beyond the short term, it's made me realize, that the hockey player, the Canadian hockey player Wayne Grestsky, in his quote, that he skates to where the puck is going. It made me realize, yes, and maybe only skate to where the puck's going, but help decide where the puck should go. And to me, there is such power to be unleashed in terms of that we as individuals and as companies and as a society can determine where we want to be in the future, not to let the future just decide what's going to happen to us. I think this hypothetical, to start, where would you start? It's a great way it's a great callback to the book, which is really future back thinking, is to kind of say, if you had nothing, where would you start? And, how would you imagine? And then based on what you imagine, how would you get there? We end up so stuck in, so much of the here and now, years of doing things a certain way, that we become blinded to what is the art of the possible. And it's exactly as your question, how do we clear the slates to be able to form things together in new and possible different ways that we might otherwise not be able to, kind of like the inventors of the train, couldn't get past the horse and buggy in their initial design of train cars.
Well, Mark, thank you so much for coming on the show today. Where is the best place for people to go to learn about Lead from the Future, learn about the new book, and also learn more about all the other work that you do?
I think two places. One, I recommend getting the book on Amazon.com. It comes out in April, which will be either before or after this podcast goes live. And then the other is www.insight.com. Where you can learn more about how we try to help companies own their future.
Well, Mark Johnson, thank you so much for coming on today and talking all about your creative life.
Thank you, James.
If you're interested in living a more creative life, then I'd love to invite you to join me as I share some of the most successful strategies and techniques that high-performing creatives use. I put them all together in a free downloadable ebook that you can get by going to jamestaylor.me. That's jamestaylor.me to get your free downloadable ebook on creativity.